The crowd was roaring. 20,000 people on their feet, lighters in the air, singing every word they had memorized across decades of devotion. Bret Michaels was doing what Bret Michaels had always done. He was commanding that stage with the kind of presence that makes you forget he is just one human being against the weight of thousands of expectations. The bandana was tied perfectly. The voice was hitting every note with the precision of someone who has performed that song 1,000 times and will perform it 1,000 times more. From the audience perspective, from every angle in that arena, everything looked exactly as it should look. Everything looked like magic. Everything looked like the Poison frontman at the absolute peak of his powers, doing what he was born to do. Nobody in that crowd knew. That is the thing that sits with you when the truth finally emerges. 20,000 people were experiencing joy, were feeling that electrical connection that live music creates, were getting exactly what they paid for and believed they were getting. And meanwhile, the man on that stage was operating through levels of physical pain that would have sent most people to an emergency room hours before the opening act even finished their set. Not metaphorical pain. Not the exhaustion that comes from a 3-hour performance. Actual, acute, kidney stone pain. The kind of pain that does not just hurt. It rewires your entire nervous system and makes every breath feel like a negotiation with your own body. 3 nights. 3 complete shows. 3 opportunities where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong, where his body could have simply given up, and where he could have collapsed on stage in front of thousands of people and the footage would have lived on the internet forever, stripped of context, turned into memes and spectacle. But he did not collapse. That is what makes this story so difficult to process emotionally. He did not collapse because something inside him, something that is part of what makes him an artist and part of what makes him dangerous to himself, decided that the show was more important than the warning signals his body was screaming. The pain was relentless. It was not getting better between shows. It was not becoming manageable through sheer force of will or professional experience. It was getting worse, intensifying, becoming impossible to ignore even as he continued to ignore it. Every movement on stage was being filtered through this lens of physical agony. Every jump, every gesture, every moment where he would normally lose himself in the performance was instead a moment of calculation, of managing the pain, of pretending that nothing was wrong while his kidney was actively trying to kill him. And the audience, beautiful and loyal and completely unaware, continued to cheer. They continued to believe in the invincibility of their hero. They continued to experience the magic without understanding that the magic was being performed through a kind of suffering they could not even imagine. What nobody talks about in those celebrity health crisis stories is the moment of decision. The moment where you have to choose between your body and your commitment. Between safety and obligation. Between being human and being the thing people have decided you are. Bret Michaels had been making that same choice his entire career, but never quite like this. Never with stakes this high and pain this genuine and consequences this potentially catastrophic. The medical reality was simple and unforgiving. A kidney stone does not care about your tour schedule. It does not care that you have sold out arenas. It does not care that thousands of people have arranged their lives around attending your show. It only cares about moving through your system, and every moment you delay treatment, every moment you continue to push your body beyond its limits, you are gambling with your health in ways that can have permanent consequences. But here is what the audience does not understand about performers at that level. It is not just about ego, though ego is certainly part of it. It is about a relationship with your fans that has been built over decades, brick by brick, show by show, promise by promise. When you stand on that stage, you are not just performing songs. You are fulfilling an implicit contract that says I will give you everything I have, I will leave nothing in reserve, and I will make sure that the moment you spend your money and your time watching me is worth it. Breaking that contract, even for legitimate medical reasons, even to save your own life, feels like a betrayal of that relationship. Feels like letting people down. Feels like being less than what you promised to be. The crew around him knew something was wrong. That is something that has come out in interviews since the emergency surgery. People who work in touring know the rhythms of an artist's body. They know when something is off. And they watched Bret Michaels moving differently, breathing differently, existing in a way that suggested he was operating on something other than his normal baseline. But what do you do in that situation? Do you insist that the frontman cancel shows? Do you risk his career, his reputation, the livelihoods of hundreds of crew members and musicians who depend on those shows happening? The machinery of a major tour is so massive, so interconnected, so reliant on every single piece working exactly as planned, that stopping it feels impossible. It feels catastrophic. So everyone moved forward together, the artist pushing through pain that was getting worse, the crew watching and worrying and continuing to set up stages and check equipment and prepare for the next show. The fans arrived at the venue with no idea that they were about to witness something genuinely dangerous, a man performing at the absolute edge of what his body could endure. And the next show happened. And then the next one. And with each performance, the kidney stone was still there, still growing, still demanding that something give way. The question was only when and how bad it would be when it finally did. The moment of collapse often arrives quietly, not as a dramatic crescendo but as a simple acknowledgement of reality. At some point during those 3 shows, or in the hours after the final performance, Bret Michaels reached a threshold where pretending was no longer physically possible. The pain had escalated beyond the point where willpower could manage it. Beyond the point where adrenaline could mask it. Beyond the point where anything short of medical intervention could address it. That is when the emergency became undeniable. That is when the choice between the tour and his health resolved itself not through rational decision-making but through his body simply refusing to continue the negotiation. The emergency surgery that followed was not a minor procedure. Kidney stones are not something you can push through and recover from in a few days with rest in fluids. They are acute medical crises that require intervention, that require time in a hospital, that require a recovery period where your body is genuinely compromised and vulnerable. The revelation that he had performed 3 complete concerts while dealing with this medical emergency sent shockwaves through the fanbase for reasons that go deeper than simple concern for his health. It forced fans to confront something uncomfortable about the relationship between artists and audiences. It forced them to consider what they were asking for when they demanded that the show go on. Because here is the emotional truth that nobody wants to admit. Part of us, the part of us that loves these artists, secretly wants them to sacrifice themselves. We want the evidence that we matter enough to them that they will push through pain, push through illness, push through every rational reason to take care of themselves, just to deliver the experience we paid for. We celebrate stories of performers who went on stage with broken bones, who performed with high fevers, who gave everything they had even when their bodies were screaming at them to stop. We turn it into proof of their dedication, proof of their love for their craft, and proof of their commitment to their fans. And then, when those choices lead to medical emergencies and hospitalizations, we express shock and concern and guilt, as if we did not spend years romanticizing exactly this kind of behavior. The fans who were at those 3 shows experienced something they did not fully understand at the time. They were watching someone in genuine medical distress perform at an elite level while managing acute pain. They were getting a show that was not just musically excellent but was also, in a way they could not have known, an act of genuine sacrifice. And the knowledge of that sacrifice, arriving after the fact, changed the meaning of those performances retroactively. Moments they remembered as transcendent took on new dimensions when they understood what was happening behind the scenes. What makes this story resonate is that it exposes the machinery of expectation that exists between performer and audience. It reveals the unspoken agreement that says your health is less important than my experience. That says push through, keep going, do not let us down, and do not let reality interfere with the fantasy we are paying for. And it asks the question that nobody really wants to answer honestly. If we knew the price our heroes were paying to give us those moments, would we still ask them to pay it? The recovery from emergency surgery is not something the music industry talks about very often. It does not fit the narrative that gets sold about rock stars and their invincibility. Recovery means vulnerability. It means time away from the stage. It means acknowledging that the body has limits, that pushing past those limits has consequences, and that sometimes the price of continuing to perform is paid in hospital rooms and rehabilitation and the slow, painful process of getting your body back to functional. Bret Michaels had to face all of that, had to sit with the reality of what his choice to perform through pain had cost him, had to consider whether the pattern of sacrifice was sustainable or whether it was actually a form of slow self-destruction dressed up as dedication. What emerged from interviews in the aftermath was something more honest than the typical celebrity health crisis narrative. Not a quick recovery and a triumphant return to the stage, though that did eventually happen. But first, a reckoning with choices, with patterns, with the relationship between what he owed his fans and what he owed himself. The emergency surgery became a forcing point, a moment where the negotiation between his body and his career had to be renegotiated on new terms. The old agreement, the one that said push through everything, that said the show is always more important than your health, and that said your value is measured by your willingness to sacrifice, had led him to a hospital bed. The question was whether he would make different choices going forward or whether he would return to the same patterns the moment the pressure returned. The crew members who had watched him perform through those 3 shows experienced their own reckoning. They had been complicit in a way that was uncomfortable to acknowledge. They had known something was wrong and had continued to proceed with the shows anyway. They had been trapped in the same machinery that traps the performer, the machinery that says stopping is not an option because stopping affects too many people, costs too much money, and breaks too many promises. The guilt that emerged afterward was real and complicated. It was not their responsibility to force their employer to take care of himself, but neither was it comfortable to pretend they had not seen the warning signs. The fans experienced their own emotional processing. Many reported feeling guilty for having cheered while he suffered. Others felt angry at him for taking the risk, for not prioritizing his health, for putting his body in danger for their entertainment. Some felt a deeper admiration, a sense that this was what true dedication looked like, that this proved his love for his craft and his fans went beyond reason. But underneath all of those reactions was a common thread of discomfort. The revelation had forced them to confront the reality behind the magic. It had made visible the machinery of sacrifice that keeps a tour running. And it had asked them to consider what they were actually asking for when they demanded that artists give everything. The story of Bret Michaels' emergency surgery became something larger than a celebrity health crisis. It became a mirror that the entire music industry had to look into, a moment where the gap between the fantasy of rock and roll and the human reality of being a performer could not be ignored. And the question that lingered was whether anything would actually change or whether the next artist would make the same choice, push through the same pain, and perform the same sacrifice while audiences cheered without knowing the cost. Months passed. The recovery was slower than expected because recovery from emergency surgery always is. There were complications, setbacks, moments where Bret Michaels had to confront the reality that his body was not the invincible instrument he had always believed it to be. Age was part of it. The accumulated toll of decades of touring, of pushing past limits, of treating his body as a tool to be exploited rather than as something that required genuine care and maintenance. The doctors were clear about what had happened and what could happen again if he did not make fundamental changes to how he approached his health and his career. The choice to perform through a kidney stone had not just been physically dangerous in the moment. It had been a symptom of a larger pattern, a way of relating to his body and his obligations that had been slowly accumulating damage for years. What made the return to touring significant was not just that it happened but also how it happened. Bret Michaels came back to the stage different. Not diminished, not less capable, but changed in ways that were visible to people who had followed his career closely. There was a new awareness present, a consciousness about pacing, about listening to his body, about understanding that being a professional performer did not require sacrificing his long-term health for individual shows. The fans who attended those comeback performances reported feeling something shift in the energy. The performances were still excellent and still delivered everything that his audience expected, but there was a different quality to them. Sustainability. A sense that this could continue because it was no longer built on the foundation of self-destruction. The broader impact of his story rippled through the music industry in ways that were subtle but real. Other artists began to speak more openly about health crises, about the pressures to perform through illness and injury, and about the machinery that makes it difficult to prioritize well-being. Touring companies started to implement more rigorous health protocols. Managers began to have conversations about what cancellation actually meant versus what the mythology of rock and roll had taught them it meant. The emergency surgery that could have been just another celebrity health scare became instead a moment of cultural reckoning, a point where the industry had to look honestly at what it was asking of its artists and what the costs actually were. But perhaps the most important shift was personal. Bret Michaels had to reconcile his identity as a performer with his identity as a person with a body that could be harmed. He had to accept that being less than invincible did not make him less of an artist. That taking care of himself was not a betrayal of his fans but actually a gift to them, because it meant he could continue to perform authentically and sustainably rather than burning out in a blaze of sacrifice. The fans had to make a similar adjustment, had to learn to root for their heroes in a way that included wishing them well-being, that included being okay with cancelled shows if it meant they would live longer and healthier lives. The story of performing through a kidney stone became, in the end, not a celebration of sacrifice but a cautionary tale about what happens when the line between dedication and self-destruction gets blurred beyond recognition. It became a moment where everyone involved, from the artist to the crew to the audience, had to ask themselves what they were really willing to pay for the magic. And sometimes, the most important performances are the ones where the artist chooses to step off the stage, to take care of themselves, to admit that being human is more important than being invincible. That is the real show. That is what takes actual courage.